But we'll get into the study tonight. We're starting the Bible Bowl. And so Paul and Timothy, I'm not going to get into the text of 2 Timothy tonight, but I'm going to tell their story. And this is so good that we can do this. You see, there's other religious books around the world. And some of those religious books are books that you say, well, they're books of instruction. And they're books of teaching, but they're outside of a historical context. There's something really amazing we have in our Bible, in that everything written in the Bible is written with a historical context. And when you understand what's going on associated with what's writing, it just makes you appreciate what is written so much more. And you just take like this letter, 2 Timothy. We're on 2 Timothy. It's not just a dissertation of instruction. It's a letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. We're reading Timothy's mail. And I'm going to show you next Sunday night how it was designed for us. It was written in a way that we were supposed to read his mail. It's not a private letter. It's a personal letter, but it's not private. It's written for public reading. And you can see that in some things I'll point out to you going into 2 Timothy that show that. And that's wonderful, isn't it? I mean, we've got a real letter in a real historic context. And that's going to help us understand what's in 2 Timothy and why that's so important. But tonight, I'm not going to begin with the Bible. I want to begin with a quote from Shakespeare. Now, I know some of you might think I'm peculiar, and maybe I am, but I enjoy reading Shakespeare. I have read his complete works all the way through 3 times. And every time I enjoyed it more and kind of made me wish I could do it again. But it takes a lot of work to do it. And I've worked on other things, but I might get back into it again. But I caught this in the history of Richard II, Act 2, Scene 1. Old John of Gaunt wants to talk to the young king. And here's what he says. They say the tongues of dying men enforce attention like deep harmony. Where words are scarce, they're seldom spent in vain. For they breathe truth that breathe their words in pain. He that no more must say is listened to more than they whom youth and ease have taught to gloss. More are men's ends marked than their lives before. The setting sun and the music at the close, as the last taste of sweets is sweetest last, writ in remembrance more than things long past. Well, I thought that was beautiful. Old John of Gaunt, he's about to die, and he wants to talk to young King Richard. Well, that's what we have when we have 2 Timothy. We're having the last words of the Apostle Paul. And he's writing them to young Timothy. And so it says in 2 Timothy 4 in verse 6, Paul knows this is probably my last letter. And he says, I am now ready to be offered. And the time of my departure is at hand. He is ready to go into eternity. And I got one more letter I want to write. And I'm going to write my young friend Timothy, whom I love like a son. And so you've got these last words of the Apostle Paul. Isn't that beautiful that we've got those? Now I want you to remember that. We're looking at the words of a man that knows he's soon ready to die. And that should give emphasis then and understanding of the context now of what we're looking at when we look at 2 Timothy. But let me tell you their story. Paul, you see the P up there? I put the P so you can kind of follow him along. This is Paul's first missionary journey. And Paul, you remember John Mark, when they left the island of Crete, John Mark turned back. he thought, boy, it looks like this is going to get rough, is what we suppose John Mark thought. He went back home, and you know what? He was right. Things got rough. Paul and Silas, this is Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas traveled to Antioch, and they preached in the synagogue, and the Gentiles come out to hear. And the Gentiles are obeying the gospel and responsive to the gospel. And the old Jews, they didn't like that. And so it says in Acts chapter 13 and verse 50 that they were expelled from Antioch. So Paul went down, watch the P move. Ready? Here it goes. Paul went down to Iconium. Well, some of those Jews were so upset with Paul when he was preaching, they followed him there. And they tried to get them to stone Paul in Iconium. Here's what it says in Acts 14, 2 through 5. The unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. And there was an assault made both of the Gentiles and also of the Jews with their rulers to use them despitefully and to stone them. Well, Paul left, and he goes down to Lystra. And you know what happened at Lystra? They did stone him. They took him out of the city and stoned him. And in Acts 14 and verse 19, having stoned Paul, they drew him out of the city and left him for dead. Well, he wasn't dead. He got back up and went into town and went on traveling the next day. Now, there's some kind of miracle involved in this, because you just can't stone a man and leave him for dead and him get up and go on traveling the next day. So something's going on here. And Luke does not say anything about Timothy in that account. But Timothy was there. Here's where we find it. It's in our book, 2 Timothy chapter 3, 10 through 11. Paul writes, Thou hast fully known my doctrine, manner of life, purpose, faith, long-suffering, charity, patience, persecutions, afflictions, which came unto me at Antioch, and Iconium, and Lystra. What persecutions I endured, but out of them all the Lord delivered me. He's reminding Timothy in this last letter the first time that they met up with one another. And there's some other things we can surmise here. Paul goes on his second missionary journey with Silas, and he goes back to Lystra. And in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, we read the first time about Timothy, and it says, Behold, a certain disciple was there. Now notice he's already a disciple, named Timotheus, which is well reported of the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. It sounds like Timothy became a Christian during that first missionary journey. And when Paul makes his way back, he's already a disciple, and he's well known among the churches. He is a young man that has gone to these other churches in these other villages, and they're thinking very highly of this young Timothy. And Paul loved Timothy. Another reason we think that Paul's the one that taught and baptized Timothy is because in 1 Timothy 1 and verse 2, he calls him my own son in the faith, which is a way you would talk about someone that you had taught and converted. But it's not just that. There's great affection here that Paul has for Timothy. In 1 Corinthians 4:17, he called him my beloved son. In 1 Timothy 1:17, my son Timothy. In 2 Timothy 1 and verse 2, my dearly beloved son. And then in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 1, my son. Now Timothy wasn't actually Paul's son. He's using terms of endearment, in terms of affection, that Paul, he loved Timothy just like Timothy was his own son. But we know that he wasn't actually his son because we read twice in Acts chapter 16. Both in verse 1 and verse 3 that Timothy's father was a Greek. Now, We learn about something about his mama, too. He's the son of, Acts 16:1, a certain woman which was a Jewish, which believed. So his mother's a Jew and his father's a Greek, and we don't really read about his father except for that, which we surmise maybe his father was dead. But Timothy, being of this mixed heritage, had grown up, and his mother is a member of the church. She believed. And then we read about his grandmother in 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5. I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith. Now that means it wasn't hypocrisy. This was sincere faith, the genuine faith. I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois, and in thy mother Eunice. Now, if we say that today, we'd say Eunice, but my self-pronouncing Bible, can I say pronouncing? My self-pronouncing Bible says Eunice is the way it's spelled out, so that's what we're going to call her. He said, I'm persuaded in thee also. That's a genuine faith, passed down generation to generation to generation. And those two women, even though Timothy's father was a Greek, those two women were able to teach that young boy. And it says in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 15 that from a child thou hast known the Holy Scriptures. So they taught him as he's growing up. He is well prepared now as a young man because of that teaching for the work which Paul is going to cause him to do. Now, I want you to remember this little finger play. And we did this in class. Get your hand up. Get your hand up. Okay? Get your right hand point with, and we'll start with the little finger. Everybody do this. Go to the little finger. Put your right here. Touch your little finger. There you go. And the name Paul means small. Okay? So it goes like this. Get your hand up. Y'all need to remember this. Ah, there you go. Okay. This is Paul, whose name... No, do it there. This is Paul, who is not very tall. Okay? Now this is Timothy, who was taught by Paul. And this is his mother, Eunice. She was nice, you see. Okay, this is his grandmother, Lois, who had faith before us. And of Timothy's father, the Scriptures do not speak except to say that he was a Greek. All right, now you remember that little finger play. And if you want to, you can even draw little faces on your fingers, you know. And then you'll kind of know the family story of Timothy when you study that. I bet your Sunday school teachers over there in Dixon, they would be so thrilled if you would show them that. When you go, you tell them that when they get there, and they'll think, man, what they can learn in a country church. You know, they're going to be impressed with that. So remember the little finger play, and that'll help you remember the story of Timothy. Now, Paul wanted him to go with him. Think about that. I mean, here's grandmother and his mother, and here's a young man, and I bet Timothy wants to go. And you know how hard it is to let your children go like that, but here they go. It says, would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they all knew his father was a Greek. Now, he didn't have to be circumcised to be saved. But this was a problem with the Jews, and Paul's going to be working with Jews, and they're, well, what about Timothy? Was he circumcised? I heard his father was a Greek. And Paul said, yeah, I did it myself. So they circumcised him just so that won't be a problem in Paul's work and in Timothy's work among the Jews. And it must have been quite the event. In 1 Timothy 4 and verse 14, Paul says, neglect not the gift that is in thee, which was given thee by prophecy, with the laying on of the hands of the presbytery. Now the presbytery are the elders. You remember how Paul had gone back and appointed elders at every place? And so here Timothy is leaving, and as he is leaving, they're talking prophecy. They're talking to Timothy about all the great things he is going to do. And they must have almost had a little ceremony. They lay their hands on him to sanction him for this work. Now notice what it says in 2 Timothy 1:6. Paul later refers to this at probably the same time, and he says, stir up the gift of God which was in thee by the putting on of my hands. Now I want you to notice the preposition. The gift is in thee by the putting on of my hands. But over here in 1 Timothy 4:14, it was with the hands of the presbytery, with the laying on of the hands of the presbytery. Paul's giving him a spiritual gift. That's what the apostles could do. While he's doing that, the elders are laying their hands on him as well to sanction this whole thing and talking about the great things. Timothy, what you're going to do when you go with Paul, you're going to mean a lot to the church. You've got many years ahead of you. And so you be a good helper for Paul and learn all you can, because someday all the work will fall on you and things like that. And so they send Timothy off with this great goodbye that they gave him. And they take off. They go to Troas. This is Paul and Silas and Timothy, and they're on their way. Get to Troas, and that's where we pick up Luke. And so the four of them, they leave Troas and they go to Philippi. And then from Philippi, we read that Paul and Silas go to Thessalonica and then to Berea. Sounds like Luke stayed behind. And it doesn't tell us about Timothy in Thessalonica, but it does tell us about him in Berea, because Paul left Silas and Timothy in Berea while he went on down alone to Athens. Now, while he is there, he sends word back, Silas and Timothy, you come join me as soon as you can. And so they come down, and when they get there, Paul says, Timothy, I need you to go on a mission for me. And this is Timothy's first big mission. He says, I want you to go back to the church at Thessalonica and give me a report. And then Paul goes on down to Corinth. And so Timothy, I got the two arrows. Paul going to Corinth. Timothy goes back to Thessalonica. And then he comes back and joins Paul at Corinth and tells him about that church. And Paul writes two letters to the church at Thessalonica, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And he begins those letters, Paul and Timothy, right there at the beginning. They're both there while he's writing these letters. So Timothy is with Paul in Corinth when he writes those two letters. Now, Paul left Corinth and made his way back to Jerusalem. And we don't read about Timothy now. So we've kind of lost track of him. Paul goes to Jerusalem, and then he goes to Antioch, and I'm going direct arrows. These weren't direct trips. To shorten this, I'm just showing it direct. He goes from Corinth to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem up to Antioch. From Antioch, he goes on his third missionary journey, and he shows up at Ephesus. And that's where we read about Timothy again. Paul is in Ephesus, and when it came time to leave, he sent Timothy on up into Macedonia. He sent into Macedonia, Acts 19:22, two of them that ministered to him, Timotheus and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a season. So Timothy goes on up to Macedonia, that's probably Philippi, and from there Timothy makes his way, probably at this time, it could have been before, but at some time he makes his way back to Corinth. And we know this because when Paul was in Ephesus, he wrote the church at Corinth telling them, I'm going to send Timothy to you. And when he's come, you receive him. Here it is. For this cause I send unto you Timotheus, who is my beloved son, and faithful in the Lord, who shall bring you in remembrance of my ways, which be in Christ, as I teach everywhere in every church. And then 1 Corinthians 16, 10 and 12. If Timotheus come, see that he may be with you without fear, for he worketh the work of the Lord, as I also do. Let no man therefore despise him, but conduct him forth in peace, that he may come unto me, for I look for him with the brethren. See, he sent Timothy to Corinth. Now I want you to come back, Timothy, and tell me. And so Paul makes his way up to Philippi, and that's where he runs back into Timothy. And Timothy gives him a report, the church in Corinth, Timothy and Titus are both giving this report to him. And Paul writes that second letter to the Corinthians. And he begins that letter, Paul and Timothy. So Timothy's there with Paul when he writes 2 Corinthians. And then Paul himself makes his way down to Corinth. And he spends the winter there. And while he is in Corinth, he writes the book of Romans and sends that letter on to Rome. I'll stop right there. And Timothy's with him there, because at the last chapter, Romans 16 and verse 21, he talks about Timotheus, my fellow worker, and Lucius, that's Luke, and Jason, and Sosipater, my kinsman, salute you. So we know Timothy's there with Paul that winter in Corinth. And now we lose Timothy again. We can't follow him, but we can follow Paul. Paul went, well, we didn't quite lose Timothy. Let me back up. Paul sent Timothy on ahead to Troas. Said, I'll meet up with you there. And then Paul makes his way up to Philippi and down to Troas, and that's where we lose contact with Timothy. We know what happened to Paul. Going directly now, and Paul didn't go directly, but we'll go directly. Paul goes from Troas to Jerusalem. That's where he's arrested, and that's where he's tried, and that's where he's imprisoned. And he makes his appeal to Caesar, and he's put on a ship as a prisoner. And that ship carries him on up after a hazardous journey where they were even shipwrecked and had to get on another ship. But Paul eventually arrives in Rome. And while Paul is in Rome, he writes some more letters. And from those letters we learn that Timothy joined Paul in Rome. Because when Paul writes the book of Philippians, he begins Paul and Timothy. In fact, he tells those Philippians that I'm going to send Timothy to you. I have no man like-minded like Timothy. He's going to come to you. And I hope to follow him after he comes. And then he'll write the church at Colossae, Paul and Timothy. And he writes to Philemon, Paul and Timothy. And so Timothy is with Paul in Rome during his first imprisonment. Now the book of Acts comes to a close. And we don't know directly what happened to Paul like we can when we follow him through the book of Acts, but we've got some idea of what happened to Paul. He was released. And he writes that book of Philippians like, oh, I'm just almost sure they're going to let me go. Now, depart and be with Christ and be far better, but it's needful for me to stay with you. And he writes and says, I even plan to come see you after I get released. And the idea is that Paul was released. And we pick this up from things we read in 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. And these are written after Paul is released. Well, what happened to Paul? Well, we know one thing. Look at the arrow going to the west. Paul had said twice in the letter he wrote to the Romans that he wanted to go to Spain. And we have a letter. It's not in the Bible. But there was a man named Clement that was in Rome. And he sent a letter to the church at Corinth. And in that letter he says that Paul went to the extreme parts of the West. Well, that's the way they would refer to Spain back in those days. So the tradition, and it's pretty strong evidence, Paul may have been able to do that. Maybe he did go to Spain. But there's something else. He had also written in the letter to the church at Philippi, the Philippians, that he wanted to come see them. And then also written to Philemon, who was at Corinth, who was at Colossae, that he wanted to prepare a place for me. I'm coming to see you. Well, did Paul really get to go to Spain? Did he get to make that trip to Colossae? Well, maybe he did. Because we're going to read in 1 Timothy 1 in verse 3 that Paul had come to Ephesus And he left Ephesus to go to Philippi. He said he's going to come see him. He said, I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus when I went into Macedonia. Maybe while he was at Ephesus, he'd made that trip. It was about 100 miles, but that wasn't anything for Paul. Maybe he'd gotten over there and saw those folks at Colossae and got back. We don't really know, but he could have. We know he went from Ephesus to Philippi. Now, we're going to try to piece together some other things from what we read, and we're guessing a little bit here. But some way along the line, he left a coat at Troas. And these are the scriptures where I'm getting this. I'm not going to quote them all, but he left a coat at Troas. Well, sounds like maybe from Philippi he's making his way back because he leaves Trophimus sick at Miletus. That's that second arrow. And then in the book of Titus, we read about how he left Titus in the Isle of Crete and told him to set things in order in those churches. I left thee in Crete with you need to appoint elders in those churches there. And we read also that he had left Erastus at Corinth. So I'm going to guess that that's when he left Crete. He made his way to Corinth and then over to a place called Nicopolis because he told Titus that I plan to winter in Nicopolis. And that's that arrow going out of Corinth. And that would have been the way you would have gone to Nicopolis. So we can kind of piece together maybe what Paul had done. But then in the end, we read that Paul's back in Rome. And so 2 Timothy 1:17 talks about me, his prisoner, and talks about come to see me in Rome. And so Paul is back a second time in an imprisonment in Rome. And this time he's not going to get released. The time of my departure is at hand. Timothy, go to Troas. Bring me my coat. Oh, so bring me the books and the parchments. And come before winter. Now, did Timothy make it? Did he get to see Paul? Well, the real answer there is we don't know, but maybe he did. Let me show you something that I have found fascinating. Hebrews. What an interesting book. And it's not written like Paul's other letters. Paul always begins his letter saying, this is from Paul. He didn't start Hebrews that way. Some people wonder, did Paul write Hebrews? He knew the Old Testament. Whoever wrote it really knew the Old Testament. That matched Paul. But he doesn't write the way Paul writes. And so there's question about just who wrote Hebrews. But we got some clues. And look at this. Look how this plays into this story. In Hebrews 10 in verse 34, we know that whoever wrote Hebrews had been in bonds. And he says, ye had compassion of me in my bonds. And we know that he was planning to go to Jerusalem. Because that's where he's writing. He's writing to the Christians in Jerusalem to be faithful to the Lord and don't return to that temple. And he says, pray for us that I may be restored to you sooner. And then we know in Hebrews 13, 23 and 24, this is right at the last of Hebrews, you know that our brother Timothy was set at liberty. So evidently Timothy was also in bonds. He was in prison, but he was released. With whom, if he comes shortly, I will see you. That is, Timothy comes to me, I'm going to go see you in Jerusalem. Salute all them that have rule over you, and all the saints, they of Italy salute you. So we know Hebrews is written from Italy. Who wrote it, and when did he write it? Well, listen, that's been a discussion for years. And I was facetious with my little class this morning. I said, no one's ever been able to figure that out but me. And of course, I haven't either. But let me give you two ideas about how that may have worked. One is, because Hebrews had been written after Paul's first imprisonment. And so he was released from those bonds. Luke was there. Timothy was there. Timothy is released. I like to go to Spain. I'd like to go to Philippi. I'd like to go to Colossae. I'd like to go to Jerusalem. And so Paul's got all these plans, and we don't know how much of that he fulfilled, but he's writing it from Italy. Now that's one idea about Hebrews. Here's the other one. And that was released after Paul's second imprisonment, and after Paul was put to death. And Luke is with him. And Timothy is there. And Luke comes to Paul. We know Luke was with him from 2 Timothy. Luke comes to Paul, and while they got Paul prisoner, they imprison Luke, and they imprison Timothy. And Paul tells Luke, Luke, this is what I need you to do. You need to write a letter to my brethren in Jerusalem. And I want you to tell them this. And he tells him. So Paul is put to death. And Luke is released. And then Luke writes that letter for Paul. See, Luke never put his name on his letters. It's the kind of way Luke would write Hebrews. But it's the content you'd expect to find in Paul. So Luke writes this letter for Paul and says, now, Timothy's been released as well. And if he'll come see me, we're going to come see you. And they of Italy salute you. Now that might be the last we read of Timothy right there in Hebrews. But that's just kind of guessing. But those things intrigued me to see how maybe we can pull all of this together now. Here's what we have in 2 Timothy. These are Paul's last words. Either way you go. They're the words of a dying man, the setting sun, the music at the close, the last taste of sweets. We owe so much to the Apostle Paul, and here we're going to be able to study the last letter he wrote and get all we can out of that. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6, Paul says, I am ready. He's ready for eternity. I went to the funeral yesterday of Lewis Battles, and his good friend Jerry Rutledge was the one speaking at the funeral. Talked about so many things, about how much he had loved his friend and the long time they'd spent together. Lewis Battles wasn't a member of the church. Jerry Rutledge talked to him about obeying the gospel. Said he'd listen. And after a while, Lewis decided, I'm going to obey the gospel too. And so they baptized Lewis Battles into Christ thanks to Jerry Rutledge. Jerry said, let me tell you why he did that. Because the casket right there open in front of him, he knew this day would come. And he got ready. And then he talked to us. We know that day's coming for us. Are we ready? We get all kind of things ready, expecting to live, and we don't know if we're going to live. But we know we're going to die. And someday this will be our day. And you need to do like my friend Lewis did and get ready. Paul was ready. Our day will come. The time of our departure will come. We need to be ready. Paul's looking for the crown of life. He spoke of the promise of life and of a better life. And he's ready. And so we need to get ready. That's how I want to offer that invitation. Are you ready? And if not, we need to do like Jerry did with Lewis Battles. We need to baptize you into Christ so when your day comes, you'll be ready. And you won't have to fear that day. You'll be ready to go. So let's get ready. If you need to and you want to respond to that invitation tonight, then do it while we sing this invitation song.